On this episode of the Locked On Kings podcast, I invite the enemy to my table. Andy Kamenetzky of the Locked On Lakers podcast joins me to talk about Malik Monk. Is he better suited for the Kings coming off the bench? And could he be a legitimate sixth man of the year candidate? We'll talk about that and so much more right here on Locked On Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time. Time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all regular season and all off season. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. I'm a Sacramento sports producer and reporter at ABC 10 News. And yes, I know I invited the Lakers here onto Locked On Kings. Have I lost my mind? Well, it is the off season after all. And truthfully, the Kamenetzky brothers do a phenomenal job here on the Locked On Podcast Network covering the Lakers. It made sense to have Andy on Locked On Kings again. It's not the first time he's been here to talk about the year that Malik Monk had with the Lakers. Malik's best season by far with Los Angeles. Of course, going forward, we're going to have a major debate and talk a lot about who should be the starting two for Sacramento. That debate's already going on in my comment section on YouTube, in my Twitter mentions, over email. A lot of people think that it should be Malik Monk's job because of his connections and his history with Kings star point guard De'Aaron Fox. But Andy watched Malik Monk play all last season, watched the best season of Malik Monk's career, is going to be able to fill us in on what Malik can be defensively. He'll share his opinion on whether or not the Kings should go with Malik Monk or Kevin Huerter as a starter. And he says a lot of really interesting things about Malik Monk and his potential to be a sixth man of the year. I'm warning you, though, that comes later in the interview. So stick around, listen to the whole thing, and then we will get into kind of towards the end, about 3/4 of the way through the interviews, when we really get into the Malik Monk sixth man of the year stuff. But everything is really good for you to listen to. I hope you enjoy our interview right here on Locked On Kings. Joining me right now, the host of the Locked On Lakers podcast. Hold your tomatoes, Kings fans. I invited him here for a reason. Andy Kamenetzky. Oh, well, he's doing the motion. Maybe throw a couple tomatoes at him just to give him the Sacramento welcome. But hey, Andy, welcome back to Locked On Kings, my friend. We're supposed
Virtual tomatoes can't hurt me, baby.
Well, I know.
Come on, Kings, do your best.
Lakers fans were throwing legitimate tomatoes at certain points this last season. But Andy, I brought you on because obviously Malik Monk last season with the Los Angeles Lakers just signed, reuniting with De'Aaron Fox and the Sacramento Kings. I remember reading before the Kings signed Malik that he was interested in returning to the Los Angeles Lakers. Sound like the Kings could ultimately offer him more money. And like I mentioned, the Fox and Monk connection from the Kentucky days, I'm sure, played a major part in that decision. But Andy, I really wanted to dive in with you about the season that Malik Monk had last year and kind of get your idea on what kind of player he is now and what you kind of expect him to be with Sacramento, going from a situation where even though the Lakers struggled last year, he's playing next to clearly identified stars versus in Sacramento. They do have two stars, but they don't have that winning history yet that he can add on to. So before we dive into that specifically, Andy, I just wanted to ask you, what did you notice most from the season that Malik had last year? Statistically, his best season of his career, and it's not close.
He's got a pretty full offensive game, like in terms of the different things he can do. He is. I knew that he was athletic just from having watched him, but I didn't realize just how athletic until seeing him on an 82 game basis. Like he can really be explosive around the rim. He can be good in transition. I knew that he was a scorer, but I wasn't aware of all the different ways. He can be very clever with his handle. He's got a few tricks in his bag, and he's a really confident offensive scorer. I think it's debatable whether he is better served as just a full-on green light sixth man off your bench as opposed to a guy with your starting unit that's going to be going up against, better defenses, but I think, and really more importantly, better offenses, because defense is definitely a weakness for Monk. But if you're looking for a guy that can really get cooking at times, Malik Monk is pretty good.
Yeah, the defense, you brought that up. The Kings also traded for Kevin Huerter, and I'm fascinated with this training camp upcoming. I think it's going to be a battle between Monk and Huerter for that starting spot. As of right now, my edge is to Kevin Huerter, one, because of the success that he's had at times in Atlanta, and two, because I know a little bit more of what Huerter can do defensively. But Monty McNair and the Kings shared in their introductory press conference that they challenged both of them to be better defensively when they brought them in. So I know that is, from what we understand, and Malik said it himself, that's going to be a focal point for his game. But did you notice any flashes or stretches of, okay, he can be a good team defender, or at least a solid team defender, not a negative defender at any time in LA, or was it pretty bad consistently?
I mean, he had moments, and to Malik's credit, and I think in a lot of ways to Malik's transparency, he really worked on that end in ways that, by his own admission, he had not always done in Charlotte during his last season there. He was frustrated by the role he had, or in his mind, the lack of role, and sort of the lack of consistency with his minutes, the lack of consistency in the way that he was employed. And I think it was very obvious to him, rightly, that the organization was not committed to him. And Malik Malik allowed that frustration, I think, to develop a screw it mentality when it came to defense and not really investing himself. And look, the truth is, I don't think Malik can ever become more than a neutral defender who occasionally will have good defensive moments, because he's very slight, even for his position. Like, he's not a particularly strong guy. He can get bullied. You know, there's certain physical elements that are really going to prevent Malik Monk from ever, I think, becoming a high-end defender, no matter how much he wants it. But what I think does matter is how much he wants to be the best version of himself defensively, whatever that ceiling is. And I thought he did a really good job last season buying in to what Frank Vogel wanted from him. And you could see that investment, even if the results aren't always there. And to be clear, the results matter. You know, I mean, the best effort in the world doesn't make it any better if Malik's assignment ends up scoring and you're thinking somebody should be able to stop that. But it all begins with attitude and wanting to be better and holding himself accountable on that. And I do think Malik did a better job over the course of last season, really investing more defensively. He's got a ways to go. Don't get me wrong. And I can promise Kings fans, you will get frustrated by this at times.
Mm-hmm.
But if nothing else, from the way Malik himself talked about it, much less what other people I know who cover the team or things I read about, all that stuff, I think he worked more defensively, and that's a really good start.
I really like what you said, that you think he's at best a neutral defender that can have good moments, because I think that describes maybe half of Sacramento's roster, truth be told. Like you look at De'Aaron Fox has never been known for his defense. He's shown defensive flashes. De'Aaron Fox should be significantly better defensively than he is, in my opinion. A lot of it is effort based, but at the same time, too, when he spent most of his career lining up next to Buddy Hield, who doesn't play a lick of defense, he can have the same mentality Malik had: is why the hell should I give my all defensively when the guy next to me is not doing his job? So the way I look at what the Kings are hoping Mike Brown is going to do with this roster is just get this team to be a good to average team defense. There are a couple of really good individual defenders on this team. The rest are neutral to net negative. If you can get a cohesive team, a cohesive group to at least communicate defensively, pick each other up when rotations are blown or whatever, and the Kings are just middle of the pack, I think that honestly might be enough just to get them into the playoffs with how good we expect their offense to be. But going back to Malik,
really quick, just on that, that's where I think Mike Brown is going to be really valuable for the Kings, because, you know, I covered Mike during his period as head coach for the Lakers, and while it was a very tumultuous period and really chaotic, one thing that really stood clear is that Mike Brown is like a defensive guru. And we've seen he's been a part of extremely successful Golden State teams. Like, I think Mike Brown is readier now to be a head coach than he was then with the Lakers. You know, both just from what I've heard from people who've been around him since that period with the Lakers, and just the way I would expect him to grow and the way he's frankly stayed employed. You know, I don't think he certainly was ready for the challenge of being that team's coach with Kobe and Powell and Steve Nash and Dwight Howard. I think he was in over his head in that moment, all the tension that was going on with that team anyway. But he's a very good communicator of what he wants. And if you're talking about somebody like Malik, who, again, there are certain physical limitations that are just going to prevent him from being a plus defender on a regular basis. I don't think that's possible for him physically. But if he's going to become a better team defender, a lot of that is going to come down to really understanding what you're supposed to be doing in the first place. And I think Mike Brown can be really helpful for him and some of the other guys on the team.
Yeah, I spoke with Steph Curry up at the celebrity golf tournament in Lake Tahoe and asked him a question about Mike Brown. And the word that he kept using over and over again, which I liked, was accountability, that Mike is going to hold everybody on this roster accountable. And hopefully that accountability, not just for Malik, but for De'Aaron as well, and for everybody on this roster, actually produces results. But going back to Malik specifically, when he had those good moments defensively, was it because, Andy, he was giving the effort needed to make those moments? Was it something specifically like the athleticism or high basketball IQ or something that stood out that was help making big plays? Was it like steals, deflections? What was it that when Malik Monk was playing his best defense, what was he doing?
I think being in the right place to be disruptive, getting in the lane to steal a pass or being instinctively in the right spot for like a hard double, something like that, where you end up inducing a turnover. He would occasionally have good moments like staying with a guy on a drive, backpedaling, but that's not really his strength. And again, the more you can bully Monk, the more you're going to end up getting the best of him and taking advantage of him. I mean, some of those same limitations are why he's frankly not a great rebounder, but he is really athletic. He's a guy that I think can thrive in chaos, like the best type of chaos. Like if Malik Monk can have the freedom to roam a little bit and cause problems for the other team just through a bit of, again, sort of organized chaos, if that makes sense. That's where I think his best defensive moments come in. And again, he is never going to be your stopper, and he is never going to be somebody that I think you want to be sort of the backbone or the communicator of your defense, like the guy that's going to hold everybody else accountable. But I think there are times where he can be chaotic in a really good way defensively.
Today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is brought to you by Built Bar and their new Coconut Brownie Chunk Puff. From the people who invented healthy and tasty comes the latest gift to your taste buds. You've probably tried the amazing Coconut Brownie Chunk Built Bar, but guess what? Your friends at Built have given Coconut Brownie Chunk the Puffs treatment. That's right. The Coconut Brownie Chunk Built Bar flavor that you love is deliciously now a chewy marshmallow covered in 100% real chocolate. It's like a fluffy cloud of coconut brownie yumness. Stop drooling and listen. They are good for you. They're low calorie, low sugar, high protein, and of course, delicious. Coconut Brownie Chunk Puffs are only here for a limited time. Go to built.com right now. Make sure you don't miss out. They are going fast because they taste amazing. All Built bars are made with collagen protein, which your body absorbs more efficiently and provides ton of health benefits. Eat something that tastes good and is good for you. Delicious coconut, rich, sweet brownie, creamy marshmallow. Stop fantasizing about it and actually get to built.com to order your box of Coconut Brownie Chunk Puffs right now. Go to built.com. Use promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off of your order. Again, that's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off. We're imagining the idea of Malik, whether he's starting or coming off the bench, he's going to play minutes alongside Fox and Sabonis. And what I like that the Kings have done this offseason is they've done stuff that makes sense to everybody, which is you have two really solid players who do most of their scoring around the rim, surround them with shooters. So they've gone out and gotten shooters and brought them in. We're imagining these scenarios where Fox and Sabonis are drawing so much attention that Malik Monk is going to get open shots and going to have a lot of room on the perimeter to be effective. Kind of like when he's playing next to a guy like Anthony Davis or LeBron James that takes so much attention. How was Malik's off-ball movement, maybe his being a poacher around the three-point line? Like, what did you notice from that element of his game, taking advantage of when defenses would kind of lose track of him a little bit because they're so focused on a star?
I think he can cut reasonably well. I noticed that over the course of the season that he's really, I think, just got a good feel for offense, period. I mean, he knows that that's his strength. I mean, that is what's keeping him in the league, that ability to score. And, he's not a perfect offensive player. And there can be times where I think he might disrupt an offense a little bit just because he's looking to do, he's looking to get going. And so, this happens a lot for guys who are score first, who are not necessarily fully well-rounded players. Although I will say this was something that really surprised me with Malik Monk. He is a better playmaker than I thought he would be. He showed flashes of that over the course of the season. It's funny. He will throw some passes that are really slick, and there are times where those slick passes are straight up wild. Like you just have to price in that occasionally Malik is going to go into Irvin Malik Monk Johnson mode, and you're like, "The hell are you doing, man?" Like that, like you are out over your skis. But there are other times where he will be running the break or fed while he's off ball cutting, and he will throw a slick pass to a guy also cutting towards the rim, like over the shoulder or maybe even behind the back. And he's better at that stuff than I thought he would be. Like I really was not, to be honest, familiar with him as a playmaker because there's only so many times you either get to watch Charlotte or, frankly, over the last few years, want to watch Charlotte.
Right.
So that was something that I was very pleasantly surprised by with him. And that's also another way where he can find utility in an offense. You talked about like off ball, that sort of stuff, just beyond ball is in his hand directly looking to score.
I know you follow the NBA very closely, not just, of course, the Los Angeles Lakers. So you're very familiar with Kevin Huerter and what he did in Atlanta as well. Do you think it is going to be a tight battle based off your understanding of both those players between the two for the starting spot? And would you give Malik the edge because of his history with Fox and what he's done in LA over Huerter? Do you think that's a spot that he could win? Or as of right now, would you pick Huerter for that spot?
It's interesting. I think some of this comes down to who else is on the bench. And like if you're looking to get the most out of Monk, you might actually want to play him off the bench so he actually has more opportunities to be a focal point scorer. Because and granted, some of this is I don't have the same familiarity with Herter as I do with Malik Monk after a year of watching him game in, game out.
Right.
But I don't think Kevin Herter is as good of an individual scorer, like overall scorer, than Monk. So that being the case, I wonder if he'd be better utilized, not necessarily playing as much with Fox and other designated scorers, designated guys who will have the ball in their hands more often. Like if you're actually going to get the most out of Monk, if you can actually isolate him more with opportunity to be a focal point scorer as opposed to having him wait for his opportunities to come, which to me at least feels like a better role for Kevin Huerter.
Interesting. Yeah, the focal point scorer, I wonder, could be. I know Kings fans are infatuated with. They've seen the highlights of Fox and Monk together and want to reunite that. And of course, I understand why. But the idea of, especially with Davion Mitchell being the theoretical sixth man or backup point guard, he showed flashes at the end of last season of what he could be offensively. But you pair him with a guy like Malik Monk who can carry some of that scoring load, and then whoever else the Kings decide to bring in off the bench as well. I could definitely see that. I just can't wait for training camp too.
Ultimately, how many scorers, like real scorers, do you picture on this team, like ball in their hands scorers? Because I think in certain respects, that answers your question.
Fox, Sabonis, Terrence Davis, Malik Monk. That might be it.
Right.
Oh, Keegan Murray, maybe, but we haven't seen it at the NBA level yet.
Sure.
So probably five at best.
Right. And Keegan Murray is going to be a guy that Sacramento is going to be wanting to develop. I mean, even if they're looking to be competitive this year, he's too important to not develop in the goal of getting a play-in bid. I mean, that's getting way ahead of yourselves and I think not prioritizing things right. The way Malik talked about, he did an interesting interview with, I believe it was Jovan Buha with The Athletic, where he had talked about the possibility of taking less money to stay with the Lakers. And I think ultimately with the Lakers, they were capped in what they could offer him. And, Sacramento outbid them, but they outbid the Lakers in part because they could.
Yeah.
But, he also talked about caring more about closing than starting. I mean, he wants to start because everyone wants to start. Everybody wants the status. But he said it was, or I believe his brother may have said it. His brother's his agent, Marcus Monk. But he said that closing minutes and overall minutes were more important to him than when he starts, which is just it's attitudinally what you want to hear.
Right.
But B, that might make it so Monk could come off the bench, but still get those high leverage minutes with Fox and Sabonis and the most important players on this team, and be happy and actually work out well for Sacramento.
Is sixth man of the year, you think, within the realm of possibility for a guy like
Yes.
Malik Monk? Okay.
Yes. I mean, in certain respects, I think it'll depend on how well Sacramento does, because I think it's unusual for a player to get that type of award on a middling team. But if Sacramento can stay at minimum in the play-in mix, yeah, I do think it's possible.
Let me ask you this. You mentioned the Lakers being capped and what they could offer him. Do you think they're regretful or frustrated that he's gone, or more indifferent because it's Los Angeles and they typically can replace this type of player?
Well, I think, in all honesty, I mean, my brother and I, we do the podcast together. Both of us really loved Malik's story. We didn't get to know him personally because with a lot of the COVID rules and
Right.
also sort of the logistics of recording our show after games, going to the building would have been difficult on a regular basis. But he seems like a great guy, and he seems like a guy that's learned a lot from some early struggles in his career. He had a substance involved suspension, and he had some moments of immaturity that, by his own admission. There was a lot of growth that we saw on this team. He was one of the very few bright spots of last year's season for the Lakers. Him and Austin Reeves as the Arkansas boys together was a really fun story. And Malik seems like a good guy, and I'm very happy for him. But for the Lakers, I didn't think it made sense for them to prioritize him because they have so many guards as it is. And Malik is not a guy that you can, slide to the three. They need wing help more than they needed another guard, even one that had as good of a season as Malik. And while they didn't necessarily address that as well as you would have hoped in the offseason, I don't think Malik Monk would have been the best use of their taxpayer mid-level, but I guess the other side of that argument is I don't think Lonnie Walker was the best use of their taxpayer mid-level exception.
Last thing I have for you, Andy. Once again, I've seen these rumors and reports, and of course, being a local expert, what's real and what's not, and where there's smoke and where there's just fabrication. Seems like Buddy Hield is once again an interest of the Los Angeles Lakers. Is there smoke to that fire, you think, or is there fire to that smoke rather? Is that a legitimate thing? Do you think the Los Angeles Lakers are once again pursuing Buddy?
Oh yeah, I think it's definitely real. I mean, they came so close to getting him last offseason that Kyle Kuzma said he thought he was going to Sacramento.
Yep.
I mean, he said this on the record that he was fully expecting him and Montrezl Harrell to end up in Sacramento, and then at the very last minute, they ended up doing the Russell Westbrook deal. I mean, I think the Kings expected Buddy Hield to be a Laker.
We all did.
Yeah. So, and Rob Pelinka, who runs basketball ops for the Lakers, when he was an agent, Buddy Hield was his client. The Lakers need shooting. So, and there are so many parameters involved with getting Kyrie Irving, who is by all accounts and appearances their first choice. There are factors in this that are genuinely, I think, beyond the Lakers' control. Like putting aside getting a new home for Russell Westbrook, put aside, like, do you include 1 pick, 2 picks, whatever? There's a lot of stuff on Brooklyn's side involving Kevin Durant that until that is settled, I'm not sure the Lakers can make an offer for Kyrie right now that Brooklyn would actually accept.
Right.
So there may come a point where they say this is too complicated. In the meantime, Buddy Hield is somebody that we've liked and is, I would think, easier to get than Kyrie Irving right now.
I would say so. But so if you could turn back time, or if the Lakers could turn back time Do you think they would choose to do the Sacramento deal over the Washington deal?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely
I
they
figured.
would.
Well, Kings fans, if nothing else, you can take solace out of that the Lakers regret. And the Kings, honestly, in a way, felt used and screwed over at that time. I mean,
Well,
in the end, they ended up
it's
moving Buddy Hield to get them
it's
all this
only
money.
because they should.
Okay. All
I
right.
mean,
Where's
look,
my
it was real. I'm not to be just so this doesn't end up being taken in the wrong way. The interest was real. I mean, it
Yeah.
was again, Kyle Kuzma thought he was going to be a King.
Mhm.
It's more just the idea of I can understand where the Kings were upset that they thought they had a deal,
Mhm.
and then like really just out of left field, the Russell Westbrook thing happened, and I'm sure there must have been some reaction in that front office, just like I know my reaction, Brian's reaction, most Laker fans' reaction, like really,
Yeah.
like really Westbrook, seriously,
I remember being
why?
very intrigued. I remember being frustrated, but nobody was more frustrated than De'Aaron Fox was going into next season. And I'm not saying that De'Aaron Fox and Buddy Hield hated each other and didn't get along, because that's not the case at all. But De'Aaron was visibly frustrated going into next year because he was still had players on his roster, Hield and Bagley in particular, who did not want to be here, and he felt the Kings were just wasting his time. So who knows what the landscape would be for both teams had that trade gone through. But I think at least the Sacramento Kings, I think, are in a better place today than they were at that point in time. Lakers, good luck.
I'm very confident that they regret not going the original Buddy Hield route.
Well, Andy, even with your Lakers background, we don't regret having you on Locked On Kings, my friend. Thank you so much for coming on. As always, really appreciate you. Hopefully, the tomatoes are not too ripe and or actually more ripe. Ripe is squishy. We want that.
And again, it's virtual. I mean, throw whatever vegetable you want, man. I don't care.
Hey, I will say this, and I'm in the minority here in Sacramento. I love Kings and Lakers games in Sacramento because it's a 50-50 arena. And even though the Kings fan in me can't stand that, the atmosphere is one of a kind, and I absolutely love it. So if we could get the Kings and Lakers rivalry back, I'm all for it.
I was going to say, is it still as like crazy and loud and heated as it was? Because I attended a few Lakers Kings games in Arco, and that was insane.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's that level. It's. I mean, for the Kings, there might be that venom. For the Lakers, they're like, hey, what the hell? You haven't been relevant for almost 2 decades. So I will get back to that. I hope, because that's really fun. But it's still let's put it this way. The last time I went to a Kings Lakers game, there was a fight at some point during the game, which is kind of par for the course. But it's not nearly as venomous as it used to be.
Okay, fair enough.
But one day you and I will be throwing fisticuffs virtually at each other during a playoff series. I can't wait for it, Andy. Big thank you to Andy for joining me here on Locked On Kings. I appreciate you getting through having a Laker guy on. Andy, really, we were talking afterwards when we stopped recording. We talked a little bit more about the Buddy Hield trade, and then we were talking about the Lakers-Kings rivalry, which, of course, it means a lot to us here in Sacramento, right? And even those who remember the early 2000s, if they were Lakers fans that long in LA, remember how good that rivalry was. But really one of the best rivalries in the history of sports. And we would love for that rivalry to some extent to come back here. So I can't wait for the opportunity for the Sacramento Kings and Los Angeles Lakers to meet for the first time next season. We'll see what kind of team the Lakers end up having. The Sacramento Kings team, I think, is significantly improved. And the Kings snatching Malik Monk away from the Lakers, really being able to outbid the Lakers, might end up being a major move for them. Malik Monk coming off the bench, winning Sixth Man of the Year, that would be something, wouldn't it? And Andy does seem to believe that it's possible. So why don't you weigh in on that, plus anything else that we talked about? You can reach me on Twitter at MattGeorgeSack, email me mattgeorgesports@gmail.com, or leave your thoughts in the YouTube comments section down below. Appreciate your support. Can't wait to have you join me on the next episode of Locked On Kings. Until then, my name is Matt George. You have been listening to the Locked On Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.